My name is Mark Perryman. I'm the co-founder of the Sporting Outfitters of Intellectual Distinction, also known as Philosophy Football. I'm a regular media commentator on England fan issues. I've lost count of a number of newspapers, TV channels and radio stations in the last week who called me about Brazil. I'm all going to give them all Clara's number so they can all call you instead of speaking to an English person who's never been to Brazil in the first place. And we've conceived this session, which is about Brazil 2014, whatever happened to the beautiful game. So if you thought you were in the session on the 1917 revolution, you're in the wrong room. I'm sure we can bring that into the conversation if you want to, but this one's about Brazil. And it's a very simple idea behind the session, and it's the same idea of the session which we organised a year ago at the Dangerous Ideas Festival, which is that popular culture in general, sport in particular, is an absolutely essential space where ideas are formed, contested, challenged, and sometimes changed. So it's not that sport is political. The argument is that sport, for many people, is politics. And the second idea behind the session is that if you don't take popular culture seriously, in general, and sport in particular, then you're not taking progressive change seriously. Because if you can't translate your political ideas into the space described as popular culture or sport, then you're not going to reach the bulk of people. So that's the idea behind the session. And as I said, it's not a rally, it's not a meeting, it's a conversation. We've brought together an astonishingly impressive panel. One has flown in from Moscow, and one's flown in from Rio to join us. But that doesn't mean that in this room, at least, we're all equal. And so I want you to join in, I want you to put your hand up, I want you to interrupt, I want you to challenge, I want you to emphasise a point and say, no, that's not my experience. All I'd ask is that you put your hand up, and we're asking the panel to keep their contributions short and punchy, and we'd ask you to do the same. Again, we want to break from the culture where the hand goes up and then we hear a 15-minute speech from the audience. Okay? We want to keep it nice and short, punchy, and keep the conversation going. I'll introduce each panellist in turn. They've all been given a question to begin with, and then we'll just see where the conversation goes. And I'm going to introduce David Goldblatt, who is the author of this magnificent and very new book, Football Nation, A Footballing History of Brazil. His previous book, The Ball is Round, A Global History of Football, is a doorstopper. It's something like 750 pages long. That's about right, yeah?
It's 1,000.
But 1,000, it tells me. But don't use it to stop your door shutting. Use it to read. It's an absolutely brilliant read. It's a global and social history of football. If you haven't been listening to David's series on Radio 4, which I think we linked to via the Counterfire website, you can catch it on BBC iPlayer. Really nice. Instead of 1,000 words, you've got David in 15-minute chunks over 5 days on the history of Brazil is round. And we're going to start off with David and a question. We were both at the England game last night, and whether it's Brazil or Peru, we were sat right by the Peru fans, Peru, until England scored. Or if we're talking about Brazil, or almost any country in the world, football has this almost unique capacity to frame a national identity. What is it about football that enables it to do that, and what does that tell us?
Why is football able to do that? Well, when one goes back to Eric Hobsbawm, is that it's easier to imagine, the imagined community of the nation when you have 11 players on a field in a contested situation, because rivalries and defining who you are is about also defining who your enemies are and who you're not. The flexibility of the game, it seems to me, gives extraordinary opportunity for meanings to be kind of placed on it and interpreted, and above all that you've got the crowd. Is that the meanings of football are not produced just by footballers or however hard they try by the media and those who report it, but it is indelibly a popular experience, which gives it a kind of authenticity and spontaneity that a lot of other cultural forms don't have when it comes to representing the nation.
And when you say the crowd, that's the crowd inside the stadium, but also outside. It's where you consume it. It could be in a living room, it could be in a pub, it could be in a town
Well, it's
square.
the dynamic of both. I mean, because, you know, you've got the crowd in the stadium, and without that, the actual spectacular event becomes flat and meaningless and awful. So you've absolutely got to have the crowd reacting and interpreting. But of course, yeah, television and other media forms transform it. So, you know, it remains the case in this country that England, Germany, 1990 got a bigger TV audience than the royal wedding.
Hurrah!
26.5 to 24.2, so we're winning. And that's extraordinary, you know, I mean, it's the same just as to say of Brazil, certainly hitherto, since television became widespread in Brazil, you know, something approaching 95% of the country is watching the football when Brazil are playing at the World Cup. But I don't think anywhere, for any phenomenon in any country, 95% of people doing something simultaneously, that's just off the scale of collectivity.
Great. That's really helpful. I mean, that links really neatly to the question that we've got for Sue Branford. Sue Branford is the managing editor of the Latin America Bureau, which is a kind of sort of campaigning think tank around the politics of Latin America. We just published, if you want a really handy guidebook to have beside the TV through the tournament, when John Motson or Gary Lineker or Adrian Charles are telling you that Sao Paulo is a wonderful place, just check out Sao Paulo here and you'll be able to read about the politics, the culture, the geography that BBC, ITV, Sky Sports News, Channel 4 won't provide. And it's really, really excellent little guide. What David was saying there about the collectivity of the crowd, the community of the crowd, Hobsbawm's imagined community of millions, in English terms, and I use the term advisedly, English terms, that is a deeply apolitical crowd, an unpoliticised crowd. It's not the crowd, you know, those of you who know your social history, it's not the crowd of George Roudan, it's not the crowd of a peasant revolt. In Brazil, the crowd is incredibly politicised, and I teach a module on football culture and community at Brighton University, and I often say to the students, they're not counterfire readers, they're not the kind of students who'll probably come to Dangerous Times Festival, they're following sports coaching degrees. So I say, look, I'm guessing you don't know a lot about British trade unionism, and they all like glazed eyes. And then I said, well, you've probably heard of a guy called Bob Crow. Oh, yeah, he died a few weeks ago. He's that bald-headed bloke, he's a communist, stopped a tube and a Millwall fan. Yeah, I said, that's the one. Well, in Brazil, just imagine, on Monday, they have a referendum, not for Scottish independence, but to abolish the Queen. They abolish the Queen. And on Tuesday, they vote Bob Crow as president. That's the kind of country that Brazil is. I know Lula didn't do quite as much as many have hoped he would, but that's the kind of society that we're talking about. So what does that mean in terms of a very highly politicised society in Brazilian terms, Sue?
It is highly politicised, and I think people take to the streets. I mean, when I first went to Brazil, which is a long while ago, I went there to work as a foreign correspondent in the 1970s, and Brazil was ruled by a military dictatorship. And industrial workers took to the streets to protest against the military dictatorship, to demand trade union freedoms. And it was extremely dangerous. And I mean, I think this is why I love São Paulo. A lot of people find it quite a difficult city, because I've got all these memories of thousands of people in the streets mobilising against the military dictatorship, and it led eventually to the military stepping down. And the football, which I'm not an expert on, but football is related to this. The football teams wear armbands, see themselves very much as part of what's going on in society. So we've had mobilisations at key points. We've had it in 1980, again, people taking to the streets to demand a return to to be allowed to elect directly their president, Diretas Já. We want elections now. It didn't quite succeed in the terms it wanted to, but it did lead eventually to the military stepping down. We had, when I went back to Brazil in 1991, I got off the plane on the Sunday. It was the first big demonstrations in the country, millions demanding the impeachment of their president for corruption. They got that. And then last year we had people taking to the streets demanding that the government do more for the people. Don't spend so much money on the World Cup, but invest more in hospitals, education, the things that will benefit ordinary people. So we've got this very sort of positive side, but there's also another side which we have to get our heads around. Portuguese doesn't have a word for accountability. I found this quite hard when I first went there. It's to hold the governments, to hold big institutions to account is something that is emerging but hasn't really emerged strongly from Brazilian culture. And you can understand why. I mean, slavery was only abolished 125 years ago. So and until then, a lot of the black population was a commodity. The idea of rights for these people was very alien. So the whole kind of idea of people winning rights, of actually making that conquest is quite complicated. After the military stepped down, they got a very progressive, a good constitution, a new constitution in 1988. But now there's having the whole kind of struggle to get this constitution respected, and it's a difficult process. They are sort of getting a word. They still haven't really got a word for accountability, but they have something they call fiscalização, which is sort of monitoring, which is a kind of getting there, where it's sort of monitoring what people do, beginning to think about holding institutions to account. So we're having we've got all this sort of energy and political involvement, but at the same time they're going through a long and painful process of developing the concept of citizenship and people's rights being respected for what they are, not what they've had in the past, which was jeitinho. So if you have a problem, you find a little way around it, not because your rights have been infringed, but because you know somebody in power who can help you. This whole kind of way of getting what you want through sort of wriggling around in the system, not going and saying, my rights have been infringed, I demand that they be respected. So it is something that it is a process which is happening, but it's quite difficult. And democracy in Brazil is new. I mean, it's only after a 25-year heavy military dictatorship, they only went back to some kind of civilian rule in 1985, and it's not that long ago. So we've got a very interesting process, I think, underway in Brazil at the moment.
Well, it's interesting you cite 1985 there, because, of course, for many, Brazil's greatest victory was 1970. And I was the film of when the team returned. They're being embraced by the colonels and the generals. Yes. They're being embraced by the people, but they're being embraced by the colonels and generals. So, and for those of us of a certain age, 1970 is a sort of seminal World Cup. And then, just thinking of the World Cups they've won 5, but only 2 under democracy. So it's a new democracy in that sense. I'm going to go sort of around the first round of questions. I'm just hoping the audience are sort of building up some questions, points, challenges they want to make, and then bring everybody in.
Just got to make a challenge.
Okay.
Just to say they've won more than 2 World Cups under democracy. 2002, 1994, 1958, 1962. So there's only one.
Very good. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. There's been some man who's written a book about it. Okay. Very good. Okay. My history is sadly postmodern. Okay. Justin McGurk has just brought out this book. It literally, I think, out in the last week.
It's not out.
It's not even out. Okay. So I'm flourishing a pre-publication copy. Radical Cities, which is a kind of architectural journey around Latin America. If you've enjoyed the writing of Owen Hatherley, who's a great writer on British architecture, but it has to be said, when he's writing about British architecture, he's chosen the bleakest parts of Britain, whereas Justin takes us everywhere in Latin America with this curious combination of politics, geography, architecture, to create a sort of map, if you like, a literary map. He is a former design critic of The Guardian. He's written for a wide range of publications, including Condé Nast Traveller. He's a curator, an award-winning curator. And you have a chapter in here about Rio, which is about to be in the news because it will host, a lot of World Cup games, but most importantly, the final. And probably thinking 2 years ahead, I'm sure we'll organise, if we're invited back, we'll organise a session on the Rio Olympics, and maybe Clara will be in London again, so we'll have a Rio citizen, it's going to be even more in the news, because to me, 2016 is going to be more important to Brazil than 2014, because this will be the first South American Olympics. So it's a seminal moment in Brazil. What has been the impact of hosting the mega sporting event on Rio's particular model of urbanism?
Well, as you infer, I think that the Olympics are going to affect Rio much more than the World Cup has. That's the project around which all of the kind of major infrastructure projects are happening. And my critique of this process is that the powers that be in this kind of very high stakes urban game, that is the politicians, the developers, the International Olympic Committee and FIFA, all lose sight of the question of who is the city for. For me, these mega sporting events, if they have any social purpose apart from being 2 weeks of entertainment, they need to leave some kind of positive legacy on the city, and they need to be used to level social and urban inequalities. And Rio has extreme urban and social inequalities, and for me, the World Cup and the Olympics were a huge opportunity, given the billions of dollars that were being invested in the city, to address some of those questions. And I think, unfortunately, the process has been found wanting. It hasn't really delivered the kind of legacy, and won't deliver the kind of legacy that it should have. And it's partly because of the way that FIFA and the IOC and the politicians and the developers think, which is that all of this is a big opportunity, a bonanza for them, basically. So yes, Rio's changing. Yes, they're building whole new zones, but Donald Trump is going to build billions of dollars worth of developments in the port. They're going to build metros and so on, which everybody knows that Rio needs improved transport infrastructure, but they're sending it all out to the west. If you look at what London did with the Olympics, for all that we can criticize it, at least they put the Olympics in the poorest part of the city so that it could regenerate and kind of reimagine that piece of London. And Brazil is doing the same thing, but it's doing it out in the west, effectively in a kind of nouveau riche suburb where the property values are much higher.
Where the Hampstead hosting the Olympics.
Exactly, and where the developers can kind of make a real killing. And that's not really what we expect of this process, to be honest. I mean, there will be, I don't want to be entirely negative, there will be benefits. They're building kind of new bus routes and new metro lines. But if you look at the actual impact that's going to have, and if you look at the situation where Rio has something like 700 favelas, that situation is not going to be drastically improved. There's not going to be any kind of real social legacy. They're improving the Maracanã Stadium, which is surrounded by the biggest kind of, one of the biggest favela networks in the city. But those people's lives aren't going to be changed by that event in any way, and the infrastructure around that is not going to be improved. So, I don't want to speak too long about it. I mean, that gives you a kind of idea of the way this works. I mean, FIFA's going to make $1 billion out of Rio. What are the favelados going to get out of it, apart from some entertainment? And not to contradict you, Sue, too much, I mean, I think you made an excellent point, but the point about Rio being, Brazilians being political, actually, I think what we saw last year with these demonstrations, that was a political groundswell that was actually not that characteristic. They don't take to the streets that often. And there had been years of kind of almost disillusionment and apathy, and that was a real political awakening, and it took football and the Olympics to really do that. People know they're being swindled. People know that this money is not benefiting them, that they want FIFA level education, they want FIFA levels public services. They're not going to get it out of this, and I think that's a shame.
Great, thank you very much. I was beginning to see hands. I'd just like to bring in our last panellist and then bring in some audience contributions and questions and so on. Justin flew in from Moscow yesterday and then went to Wembley, so given our public transport system, probably got home from Wembley very late, but Clara beats that because Clara's flown in from Rio, so a round of applause, I think. Clara is from Rio. She's a Botafogo fan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yes. She's a journalist on Veja, nearly there, Brasilia. Yes. And she's written a fantastic chapter in this brilliant collection of Latin American writing, which is just out, on Romario. And when you read about Romario, who was an absolute star of the Brazilian football team, And then when you also read, if you've got the cards on your seats, Socrates' words, beauty is everything, winning is secondary, what matters is joy. You wonder, where are the philosophers and the politicians to match Socrates and Romario in the current England squad? Or past England squads. And that's not to indulge in national self-hatred, it's just a fact of our national culture, I would say. So what I'm interested in is where does Romario fit into a sort of broader political spectrum which seems to connect the football to politics in a way that doesn't happen in what remains a football-mad country, England?
Well, it isn't exactly a surprise that in the football nations that we have congressmen that are football players. Right now we have 8 congressmen that are legitimately elected representatives. The parties look for them because they are national symbols.
8 former international footballers?
Yes, we have. Romario had very expressive voting. He was voted with more than 140,000 votes, and that's a lot. But there is also an ex-goalkeeper from Grêmio, Danley. He was elected with 170,000 votes. And that means that they carried, because of the Brazilian voting system, they have an expressive election, so they take they take other congressmen with them. They're less known and have less votes, but of course not all of them adapt to political life like Romario did. It was an excellent surprise. Now in Congress right now, he's the loudest voice against. He's the one that fiscalização for the accountability, and he's doing quite a good job in. He's there. He's looking for the spending of the public funds, and he goes against FIFA and against. He called Valk, Jérôme Valk, the FIFA director for. A public audience, and they were obliged to give explanations to the congressman and to the society. He's very different from Socrates, that was like an intellectual. He was even graduated in medical school, and he had ideals. He used his celebrity position to go against the dictatorship. He made part in the Direita Já in the mid-80s, and he was a left, and then as an intellectual, when he retired as a football player, he had a very important position in the press, writing, defending left-wing ideals. And Romario is not at all that. He's very pragmatic. He hasn't. We can be really sure about his intentions in politics, I would say. But he has causes and that he defends, and very well. So the fiscalization on the World Cup is one thing, and he's doing that very well. And also he has a daughter who has Down syndrome, so he also has many bills, and he's very active in the part with disabled policies for handicapped.
Okay. I mean, I think maybe to give a comparison, it's a bit like if Steve Ovett was sitting on the Labour benches having a go at Cameron and Johnson and co. for the way that the Olympics has been organised. It's of that kind of magnitude in terms of sort of social and sporting significance. I saw a hand over there. Was there a question?
Me?
Yeah. There's a microphone.
No, it's fine, actually. It's sort of gone.
Okay, any other... Okay, there's a question there.
Yeah, series of questions, but they are questions rather than a speech or whatever. To Sue, but also to maybe anybody else. I did read that book yesterday, which is good, the travel guide one, but a bit brief, and I just wondered if you could give us some more information, in particular on the political parties section. It doesn't say anything about PSOL, and I wondered how they were doing at the moment. And also, it does interestingly say that the MST really has been a little bit of carrot and stick. Obviously, when Lula got elected, they used the stick very much to, sort of beat off the squatters. But also the carrot with the Bolsa Familia, which seems to have, the Bolsa Familia is where if your child goes to school, then you will receive a basic income in order to try and get children into school, but also to undercut poverty in the poorest areas. So I wondered how the MST were doing, how PSOL, and final question, they are all related, is somebody was telling me that there's been a ban on demonstrations during the World Cup, and whether this would be defied, and what your thoughts are of that. I did notice in 2013 that some of the main slogans were things like "No party represents us," and that's quoted in the book as well. And I wondered if that actually, was, in your view, a sort of anti-left thing, or whether actually, the left is quite prominent and influential in those protests, and whether they will be in the next month.
I think we'll bring Sue in on the political parties and Clara on banning of demonstrations during the World Cup. Okay?
Well, to talk about the... Is this working?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
To talk about the MST, this huge movement of landless workers first, and I know it quite well because I wrote a book on them and spent a sort of year with them in 2002, which was an extraordinary... I mean, the MST would go into favelas, into poor parts of Brazil, and they would say, we're going to have an occupation, of a land occupation. Next Tuesday, we're going to come round with a bus at 2:30 in the morning, and it'll be dangerous, but you might get land at the end. And I thought, well, they don't know these people. People aren't going to do this. But we went to the bus at 2:30 in the morning, and there would be people there. And I went on several of these, which were really dangerous. I mean, the landlord sent in gunmen, and I felt really scared. And there were parents with babies and young children, and they would occupy land, and then they'd be evicted, and they'd reoccupy, and often at the end they would win land. And so it was an extraordinary sort of act of bravery to participate. And what has happened is that since Lula got elected in 2002, and he has instituted this Bolsa Familia, which means that all poor families, if they put their children into education, they get half a minimum wage per month per child, which isn't very much money, but it's actually taken people out of absolute poverty. It's made a huge difference to the people living in the shanty towns. And it means they've got a stake in the system now. And so it's become much harder for the landless movement to recruit people. But people think, oh, just a minute, I don't know, we're doing okay here at the moment. And so the whole process of these technically illegal occupations has slowed down sort of remarkably. And it's also meant, which is something we can talk about later if we want to, is that Lula, the PT, now the Workers' Party, which Lula helped set up, has now got this sort of solid support among the very poor people, particularly in the northeast, hydroelectric dams. And it's all funded by the National Development Bank, which is huge. It's 2 or 3 times bigger than the World Bank. I mean, people don't realise this. And it's a very closed authoritarian structure. People can't protest and get listened to. And this is because the PT has bought wholesale this idea that it's an urban party, that we've got to develop the country. They're not at all, well, they don't take into consideration environmental concerns. It's become a very kind of neo-developmentalist party. So there's all kind of problems on that front. Just to talk briefly about the PSOL, which I don't know an awful lot about. It took off a few years ago, and it has not really gained the momentum or the support that people hoped. It was going to become it was a breakaway faction of the PT, and people hoped it would gain a lot of support, but partly because so many people who support the Payte are these people that were really poor and are not kind of politicised in the sense of the Payte, that they would actually really understand or accept exactly what the Payte is about. It hasn't really gained an awful lot of momentum.
Okay, Clara, would you like to comment? It's under 2 weeks to go to the World Cup. You know, a lot of the media discourse in this country is about risk, about criminality, violence, the favelas, drugs, gangs, and so on. So, what is the picture on the ground in terms of a sense that the police, the security forces are closing down on dissent?
Let me think. Translating in process. I think in relation to security, we have two different things. One is violence that exists because of the inequalities of the country, and like in every big city, you have to watch out for your belongings and where you go and what time of the night, and make sure you don't look like a tourist lost in the city and with big cameras and all that. And another thing is the violence that comes with the protests. We have, unfortunately, a police that's not well prepared to deal with manifestations, and sometimes they're really violent, and that only increases the violence, and that's why we see all those images in television. We have now a threat of the police getting and having a strike. And that's I think that's what right now the government really fears is the police strike. And they have taken measures to ensure that that will be made illegal during the event if the police get in strike, and the leaders will have to pay if the Brazilian army has to ensure peace. Another thing that he asked about the demonstrations, they were not made, they're not banned. They tried to make a law that if you manifest, you could be considered a terrorist. Then you have to respond to that. But you can protest, but it's just you can go to prison as well. No, but if you're considered, it was very controversial, and it was really lacked discussion and everything, but what they tried to do was that, but the public opinion went against, so they weren't as radical as they would like to have been. So we're not all terrorists.
We'll come back to the mood during the tournament as Brazil march forward to the final in a moment. There's a question over here.
Yeah, slightly touched on already, but I was just to see if there's kind of some protests, but of a much smaller scale than in 2013. I just wondered, is that because of the threat, the kind of threat of repression, or the kind of security clampdown? But also kind of, I mean, I've read or heard people say that there's also kind of, I don't know whether this is true, a sort of sense of not wanting to protest because of a sense of national unity. And I just wondered what any of the kind of comment. So the kind of the difference in the protests in 2013 to now, why people maybe aren't kind of organising on the same scale.
Okay, so it's sort of sense. Go on, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I do. Actually, the comparison with 2013 is there was no protest at this point in 2013 prior to the Confederations Cup. It's only a week beforehand that the public transport people in Sao Paulo started making their demonstrations. So it's not really, that's not a sensible comparison really to make. Actually, the level of organisation and protest that's going on now massively exceeds 2013. You know, we've had 2 police strikes, we've had a bus strike, we've got regular demonstrations at the Seleção's training camp with people putting no to the cup stickers on the coach. You know, the Comité Popular, who are the main organised anti-World Cup, anti-Olympics movement, had a day of protest on May the 19th with demonstrations in 50 cities across the country. So there's plenty of protest, and the Black Blocs, who are the kind of youthful anarchist types, haven't even got going yet. So I would say there is a groundswell and a level of organisation, potentially of protest, far in excess of where we were in 2013. What remains completely unclear is whether there will be the transformation that happened in 2013, which is where you start with 2,000 people or 4,000 people, and then suddenly you're looking at 20,000, 25,000, eventually 100,000. And it's whether that segment of Brazilian civil society comes out and joins demonstrations, or whether they stay away. And what that will partly be determined by, I suspect, is how the police, as Clara said, we are looking at one of the most incompetent police forces in the universe, particularly when it comes to dealing with, you know, good luck to her, is what I would say. You know, the military police still operate under military law, you know, from the 1970s. And, you know, they go to the French riot police to ask how to democratically, deal with protest. That's not looking good. So I think it's very unclear. Now, what's the mood in Brazil? You know, people are torn, is my impression. I mean, I'm really interested to know what you think. You're there. People love football and people love the World Cup. Some people have got to the point where they can't stomach it any longer and they're unambiguously against, but the majority is like, come on, which way do we go? And I think really interesting on this is bunting. You know, in most World Cups, certainly for the last 30 years, Brazil will be yellow and green now, and they're not even hosting it, they're away. And it's a bit like Christmas lights, where neighbourhoods compete to have the best kind of, you know, yellow and green bunting, and people put up money, and it's at all social levels. And what I'm hearing from people, I've been calling people in Sao Paulo, in Rio, there isn't much going up. And people are like, do we want to? Do we not want to? People, you know, I think it's a really ambiguous moment at the moment, and I don't think anybody really knows quite what's gonna happen. And the possibility of it really blowing up is there, and the possibility of it not is there. And it's sort of in the hands of the actors. You know, it's a really interesting moment in that respect.
I mean, I can see some other hands. Maybe if we could move the microphone up to... I'm not sure if that's a hand or a clenched fist or a bit of both. We'll have that ready. If we just get Clara back on that and then bring you in, sir. I mean, I think it's a very interesting point there that David made. I was lucky enough to be in France during France '98, and France is not a footballing country. And up to and including the quarter-final, which France won on penalties against Italy, there was next to no interest. And then France win, and then it goes bananas. How do you think, it seems such an obvious question, but will the mood be transformed by Brazil marching towards the final? And does that mean, necessarily, the political agenda has been junked? Because the assumption from a lot of leftists, I mean, oh, they're into the football, they've forgotten their politics. It seems to me in Brazil, you can do both.
Yes, I don't think that the critical groups to the World Cup will back down. They will carry on, and we do have protests scheduled for every day now until the final of the World Cup. But I do think that the general expectation is that things will get smoother when the ball starts rolling. And of course, we can't know what, like David said, we don't know if it's going to reach the same scale it reached the last year, all those protests. But it's sure that it's the football also that it's capable of calling everyone. It's that the football has this social energy that mobilizes the society, the Brazilian society that normally isn't very mobilized. If it weren't the games going on at the same time, there probably we wouldn't have seen what we saw last year. And of course, in the second phase, Brazil is going to get Spain and Netherlands, two strong teams that were in the finals. And if Brazil eventually gets knocked, that won't happen, of course, we'll be champions, but if it eventually gets knocked out early on, then there will be a void and an emptiness there to fill.
Yeah, I think you need to be less worried about the scenario than us in England.
Maybe even England.
Yeah. I think the 21st of June demonstration is probably safe in terms of people being too distracted by the football. I don't think you need to arrange the big screens.
Yes, but what I hope personally is that we can have protests and games and everything pacifically going at the same time, and not Many compare as well this World Cup to the World Cup in 1970 when Brazil lived a dictatorship, and to support the national team was almost could be considered to be supporting the military regime.
Yeah.
So many tried not to cheer for Brazil, but it was like the most incredible team ever. We had many Pelé, Jairzinho, Rivelino. We had many good players, and after all, the passion for the football came louder and
Yeah,
stronger.
we had Bobby Moore and Bobby Charlton, don't forget. Yeah, I mean, because it's interesting in terms of, we talk about the demonstrations in 2013. This is a cup, the Confederations Cup, which Brazil won. And the mood seems to have continued, so it doesn't necessarily dissipate it. And as I understand it, Neymar came out in support of the demonstrations as well. Okay, there was a hand over there, and they're beginning to get quite a few hands. So we'll take a couple, there's a little flurry there, so if you could pass the microphones around each other, and if you could share the questions around the panel, that'd be nice.
Hi, yeah, I'm Jack Brindley from Norwich. I wanted to actually come back on the point about national unity, as it were. I mean, last year we made a film about the political potential of football to reach a mass audience of millions, because and obviously on the left there's a lot of people who are willing to write it off as sort of either bourgeois distractionism, and sort of see that in, say, George Orwell's 1984, where he writes about beer and gambling and football being the distractions of the proles, or now Terry Eagleton came out last year and said something kind of similar. But obviously it misunderstands the nature of football and how it came about as an international phenomenon, to sort of dismiss it in that way. Somebody said to me the other day that, rich people have taken it over now, so who are you kidding? Trying to get involved politically in football is ridiculous. And obviously, if you look at any international medium that's become popular, it's become popular through mass participation by ordinary people. Like, if you looked at films, films were thought until quite late on in sort of their inception to be sort of trinkets, sort of trivial things, and because of the continued mass audience that they brought about, wealthy people thought that was a good way to make wealth, and so they started to get involved. But there's still, what I wanted to ask was, because obviously out of that mass participation, there's still people's clubs have come out of that. I wanted to ask how that relates to England particularly, because I kind of find it problematic, the concept of an English national identity and trying to participate within that. I'm very much of the ABE, anyone but England camp. In fact, I was thinking of getting a shirt made up, but I think one of those will probably do much better anyway. So I was wondering, politically speaking, can you really properly engage with England football fans in that environment, or surely it's better to sort of, engage on an individual level, on sort of, even in Norwich, even in boring old Norwich?
Okay, it's quite a long question, but David?
I'm going to be very short in answering it. My belief is that in English culture, football is essentially a social democratic game in a neoliberal world, and provides both metaphorically and practically endless possibilities for political intervention and political education. And Terry Eagleton, I mean, pardon my French, but what the fuck does Terry Eagleton know about it? Is what I think. Of course we should be engaging politically. What other institution offers the possibility of collectively debating, demonstrating and inventing the English nation? What are we going to go with? Church of England, English National Opera, English Heritage? There is no collective English institution which allows the possibility of collective and creative imagining of what the English nation might be. And as the Scots might pretty soon be off, I think really it is time to start thinking what that's about. Secondly, those who constantly decry England's support as a bunch of, skinheads or fascists have simply not been to England games. I simply will not accept a scintilla of criticism from people who have not attended and actually observed what is going on. That doesn't mean it's all terribly pretty. There's plenty of ugliness of various kinds out there. But there is also a whole kind of rich range of cultural practices which have radical political potential. So I would say get out there, go and see the fans, see what's actually going on, and then reflect upon what the possibility of political intervention is.
Okay, the session isn't about England and Englishness, to be fair, and But I feel I need to respond a little bit, I mean, and just add something to what David said. I mean, since January, and we've done this before every World Cup, we've been organising fans travel forums. We get 100 or so fans to those. Now, at every single forum, and this isn't because, to use the parlance, we were desperately trying to be politically correct. We had a woman on the platform. We had a session on sex trafficking in Brazil. Now, I can't imagine a conversation of fairly working class blokes about the problem of sex trafficking in Brazil, to get them to a pub to talk about it, if England and football wasn't part of the equation. Just a few weeks ago, Sue, from the Latin American Bureau, came to talk about the politics and the geography and the culture of Brazil. Football's opening up that conversation. Exactly the same thing happened before South Africa 2010. Ordinary England fans wanted to talk about the African National Congress and who is this Nelson Mandela? What is a township? What is the legacy of apartheid? Now, that doesn't mean people immediately shift to the left, and we don't go in and lecture people, but it opens that space. It's an opportunity which we can either choose to grasp or choose to ignore. And I think the consequences of ignoring it are a lot more serious than the risks of grasping it.
I want to just point out, I have very much been to England.
Okay, can we just bring in the question at the front, okay?
Okay, I'm Brazilian, and my main concern about these anti-World Cup demonstrations is that it seems to me that it's being hijacked by the right wing. It's the same way as the June 2013, as it began with free fares, but it was quickly overtaken by very right wing, which no red flags, my flags are yellow and green, and very quickly, to the point that the people who were defending free fares pulled out of these demonstrations. That's my main concern, is that because I've got friends on Facebook now that is vai ter Copa, not no to the Copa, actually in favor of the World Cup. So my problem is, and since there's going to be elections soon, and as far as I know, there are three candidates. It's Dilma, Eduardo Campos, and Aécio Neves. And they seem, and Aécio Neves and Eduardo Campos seem to be a bit more to the right than Dilma, which seems to me that these anti-World Cup manifestations are, I think, very anti-patriotic in the Brazilian sense, not in the British sense, and also very against. It seems to be against anything that the PT have done so far, like the Bolsa Familia, the inequalities that have. I don't think it's perfect, but it has. The PT is an incredible. The government has been an incredible social advance in the country. So I think my concern is are these anti-World Cup being hijacked, demonstrations being hijacked by the right wing?
Okay, I mean, that's a very interesting point, but we're maybe looking at Brazil and the World Cup and the reactions to it in a sort of traditional West European left-right kind of continuum. It's not necessarily the same in Brazil. I mean, Justin, would you like to comment on that at all, in terms of Rio?
Listen, I can't really comment with any authority on the politics of Rio. I mean, I think that either Sue or Clara would be better. But what's interesting, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about who was protesting, as you were indicating, and I think it seems to be that it was more of a kind of middle class protesting than, like, there were favelados there, but it was not really like a working class uprising in any way. And what I'm curious about is whether the kind of favelados are actually the ones, they're all going to be sucked into the football, and the kind of this kind of well-meaning middle class is the one kind of left to protest, but actually they're in a way the best placed to make a strong political statement. But I really think I should hand over to someone more experienced.
Just my thing is, what political statements being made? Because I think the middle class in Brazil, in some ways, as you pointed out, PT's main reason is the rise of the very, very poor in Brazil have managed to improve their living standards. And the middle class, like I've got relatives of mine that were protesting against the fact that they would have to sign the carteira de trabalho of their maids. How dare the maids have any labor rights? They're part of our family. They're not. It's almost like a master-slave relationship. So the middle class, I'm more worried about what is the political statement they're being made that actually is political.
Well, I think it's quite complicated, and I think what you said was a bit of a simplification. I mean, last year, the demonstration started against this protest against the increase in fares, as you were saying, and then sort of accumulated frustrations from all parts of society, as you said, including right-wing people who were protesting because they were being forced to give labour rights to their maids, also came to the streets. And then, I mean, a lot of people on the left think they were agents provocateurs into the streets because they got very violent, or some of them got violent, and this was portrayed on television, and some people backed off. But I think when I was in Rio at the time of the demonstrations last year, and a lot of people on the left were very angry at the way in which it was being portrayed. There was still an involvement of people on the left. There were these sort of neo-fascist types as well, but it was there was a lot of different people on the demonstrations, and as far as my friends were saying, the majority of the people were actually going to the streets, at least in the early process, until some of them got a bit put off by the violence, to demand things like more investment in education and more in public transport. And one of the interesting things was that the government actually gave in. I mean, they reversed the increase in fares because the PT government felt it had to sort of respond, which is something which is sort of quite interesting, because that doesn't very often happen. The Prime Minister took to the streets against the Iraq War, and you know, we didn't get any hint of a concession from the government here. The PT government, because it still is, sees itself as a government of the left, felt it had to make a concession, and people remember this. And so in a way, it's because, I think it's partly because when the PT came to power, it promised a lot more popular participation. In fact, before it actually won the national elections, in state governments, it had experiments with involving people in participatory budgets, as they call them, getting people and people deciding how some of the budget would be spent. And the government promised to do this when it came to power, and it didn't. I mean, partly because we have to put our minds back to 2002. There was an awful lot of mobilisation internationally against Lula. People thought he was going to be this sort of radical government, and billions of dollars were pulled out of Brazil before even Lula took power. So Lula felt in fact, he'd signed a letter saying, "I won't be very, I'll respect the existing rules of the game in terms of finance." So he sort of tied his hands before he actually took government, and he's been quite disappointing in the scale of the radical reforms that he promised and he hasn't undertaken. And so a lot of this sort of demonstrations, or a large fraction of the demonstrations, were people saying, "Yeah, we were promised more than this. We were promised participation, and we're not getting it." And the government has been aware of this, but it made some concessions, and now people are telling me that, you know, that's all been forgotten. The people withdrew from the streets, and it's gone back really to business as usual. So we're getting a kind of it's complex, this, but I don't think you can really see it as a means of mobilising against the PT government. That's a faction, but I think from what I heard, the majority faction was very different.
Okay, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and which I want to link to something I'm going to ask Justin about in a moment. I think one of the things is, in terms of, most of us are going to consume this World Cup via the TV, and we will be watching it from a continent where UKIP have topped the poll in Britain, the Front National have topped the poll in France, and the far right and neo-Nazis have been elected to the European Parliament. We'd be watching a World Cup on a continent which elects Chavez as president, you know, which elects communist deputies in the Chilean parliament, you know, a generation after toppling of Allende, and where Lula, a workers' leader, can become president. So I think there needs to be a degree of humility when we sort of consume it in that way. Which links to something, Justin, your book, Radical Cities, and we've got John Rees in the audience, who's written a great book on London as a radical city, a people's history of London, and there's maybe a little bit of a fascination on the left with the urban. What is it in Brazilian terms and Rio terms, where urbanism shapes the politics, if you like?
Well, I mean, my take on this is very simple. I mean, when you talk about radical cities in, say, Brazil, people always think of Brasilia. This is the kind of quintessential modernist, radically kind of planned city. And my kind of repulse to that, in a way, is that Rio is a far more radical city because it's the birthplace of the favela, and the favela is a much more radical idea of a city than this kind of gridded modernist machine, because it has been the most successful device in the history of human vanity for absorbing vast populations into the kind of opportunities of the city, which they did themselves. And effectively, you know, I think what we could say is that the favelas, which have been maligned and you know, criticized and stigmatized for half a century or more, were actually perceived by the politicians as a good idea. They were a good idea because they absorbed all this kind of vast workforce into the economy of the city. And the big U-turn in urban policy over the last decade, 15 years, I would say, is the acceptance of the favela as a functioning, productive piece of the city, not some kind of problem that needs to be solved. For years it was seen as this kind of pre-urban condition, almost this kind of primitive thing that was awaiting development. It was, you know, government never wanted to put services there because they didn't want to legitimize what they saw as something illegal and problematic. Whereas, in fact, now we recognize that this is absolutely a functioning piece of the city. It needs infrastructure. It needs to be connected to the city proper. And these little connections, these upgradings and provisions of services are the kinds of things that could have been facilitated by the money flooding in from the World Cup and the Olympics. But that hasn't happened.
That's most helpful. I'm going to bring David in to answer a question, then I see a couple of questions here. David, you quite corrected me that Brazil's first two World Cups were under democracy. Pelé, Garrincha, 58, Pelé, Garrincha, 62. Jairzinho, Carlos Alberto's the finest team goal ever in 1970. Maybe 1994, first World Cup won on penalties. 2002 is for Brazil of Dunga. My pronunciation isn't right, I'm sorry. I have enough difficulty speaking English.
What sense the Brazil of Dunga?
Yeah, well, that's the question. Has the beauty of the Brazilian, the romantic ideal of Pelé's beautiful game, has it been diminished by the will to win?
In 1994, prior to the World Cup, Carlos Alberto Pereira, the coach of the team, gives an interview with the New York Times. He said, magic and dreams are dead in football. And that's the way he played. And while, as a historical memory, as a kind of, you know, moral and aesthetic vision, it continues to exist, in practical terms, it's completely over. I mean, just look at domestic Brazilian football. I mean, aside from the fact that all the best players are playing in Europe, it's pretty grim, tactically, spiritually. It's done.
Is Neymar a challenge to that, would you say?
Well, you know, Brazil continues to produce exceptional players of exceptional talent, but Neymar, like everybody else, has to play the sort of tactical, regimented, sophisticated game laid down by today's coaches and coaching regimes. Nobody just, like with Garrincha, says, "Oh, don't bother to turn up to the tactics session. You go and play ping pong and just do your thing when you get out there." Right? That's what was going on. That's not happening with Neymar. No one said, "Well, you just go out and do your thing, dude." You know, Filipao is like laying down the line, as with all of them. So, yeah, I actually do think it's over.
Okay. I think Clara wants to defend the philosophy of Neymar. So let's hear it for Neymar.
No, Neymar is obviously an exception to that. He plays beautifully still. But in a recent interview, Filipão said If we can, we're going to play beautifully and win. If not, we're just going to win. He really, and he said to a friend once, if you like art, go write a poem. So really...
I can make a t-shirt, thank you. Right, we've got a couple of questions over here. Can we get the microphone there? Oh yeah, got a microphone there. You've got one next to you?
I can speak.
It's easier for us to hear if you don't mind.
I just wanted to ask a question about the mobilising potential of players in Brazil, like to mobilise amongst ordinary working people, because you're saying that there's quite a few ex-players who've gone into politics. I was wondering if that's more of a kind of a career politics kind of thing, or do they have the ability to genuinely kind of mobilise ordinary working people? And maybe a question for Mark, I don't know, do you think we have that potential in England? I mean, just a little plug for my team, Millwall, massively mobilised for the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. Obviously that's kind of more of an exception than a rule, but does that potential exist, and is that potential in Brazil as well?
I'll just answer briefly, and then I'll bring maybe David with a historical perspective and Clara with a contemporary perspective. And we are meeting in the week of Joey Barton on Question Time. And Joey Barton spoke like a working class footballer. He spoke the way that he would speak, you know, with his mates, which may not be the way that we would describe UKIP. But I think he spoke from the heart, and I think some credence has to be given to that. I think this probably isn't true now, but a very good friend of mine who writes a lot on race and football made the point around the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And this was an inquiry, let us not forget, which the Daily Mail was the main campaigner for justice. So you didn't have to be on the left to recognise that something deeply wrong had been committed in society. Not a single English footballer spoke out for justice for Stephen Lawrence. But we live in a deeply, I mean, I think maybe some colleagues and friends and comrades would disagree with this, but my reading of English society is we live in a deeply apolitical society. We live in a society which is deeply anti-political. So we shouldn't be so surprised if our football culture reflects that. And so it's a struggle to get it to reflect something different, but I think it's a struggle worth having. Okay, David?
I think you should fill us in on contemporary Brazilian football politicians.
Yes, what happens is as footballers are national idols, the parties look for them and invite them to be to run as candidates. We had, and now we have 8 that were elected, but there are about 10 that weren't. But amongst the athletes, the football players, they have more potential in winning, and actually it's an interest game, and not always, they are not especially political and have political positions. I would say that other than Romário, all the other ones just simply disappeared in the political system. We can't really tell what they're doing. We have Bebeto that played in '94 with Romário. He's for the World Cup and is helping, and he makes part of the committee. We have Ronaldo as well. That he's not a congressman. He's not political, but he supports FIFA. And now that he's supporting Aécio Neves, that is candidate for presidency, he's trying to see. He's starting to criticize all the delays and disorganization and the spending, but now it's too late to detach his image from the one that he's been supporting FIFA since 2007. He can now start to say, no, that's not that good.
Okay, just another question actually that occurs to me is that in London, I'm trying to remember the acronym, I think it's something like the United Kingdom of the Commonwealth of God, which is an extreme evangelical group which originated in Brazil. And there are a number of players who identify with that. Isn't that the case? That they identify with a particular form of evangelical Christian? They take their shirts off and it says, I love God, underneath their shirt?
Many football players became religious.
Right.
And the evangelical religion, it's really growing in Brazil. They have even politically, they have a lot of strength. There are many congressmen that belongs to different churches, and they fight amongst themselves, and actually have thousands of different churches.
And the PT, the Workers' Party, has formed some kind of alliance with the evangelical Christians.
Yes,
is that correct?
they do. Coalition.
Okay, there's another question here. I think you got the mic. Okay.
Well, I was just interested really in what someone said earlier about how people in Brazil are feeling this kind of ambiguity, like do we support this, do we not? Because it's reminded me of the Olympics here, when, especially Paralympics actually, because you had, we protested against it because, it was sponsored by Atos, which was no friend of disabled people. Dow Chemicals were involved. They made everything more accessible and then took away the accessibility at the stations and things, but at the same time it represented disabled people in a different way than they'd been represented before, and it did, you start seeing disability being discussed much more in the media. I mean, that's, despite the problems with it, I think, it was, as you say, it was contradictory really, the way it affected people. So it just, to sort of make that point really, do we need to start thinking about what kind of sport do we want, and what do we like about sport, rather than just, I think the people have said really the left have traditionally just dismissed it, as some cases just dismissed it, apart from maybe CLR James and cricket. But I think we do need to start that debate about sport properly.
I think that's probably more a question for Dangerous Times Festival in 2 years' time when we preview Rio 2016. I think the essential philosophy of the left on sport should be winning your secondary. And then you're going to get a lot of support, because vast majority of the support teams would never win. Only one team can win something, or one individual can win a race. So winning is secondary, and you get a long way. But maybe Justin, I mean, you visited Rio. Is it a wheelchair-friendly city?
Wow. No, it's not. But I mean, I can't comment on the disability access thing. I'm trying to think. I mean, for me, I think you raise an interesting point about how these sporting events get used, and I think that the problem is that they fit into a very now almost kind of ineluctable, like unavoidable neoliberal politics, which is that they're basically just for profit, and that's certainly the case in Rio, and it was the case in London, although it was a great success in many ways. London had the first kind of real legacy program of one of these events. When you talk about the legacy in Rio, it's really, you've got to be pretty cynical to take the legacy aspect of it seriously. I mean, to the point where, very major slum upgrading programs that were supposed to be happening in concourse with the Olympics were actually, in fact, and the World Cup, were actually sidelined by it, because in fact all the money went into stadiums and stuff, and politicians bickering over who's going to take credit for this Morar Carioca slum upgrading scheme. They want to kind of defer it to a later parliament so that they can take credit. I mean, the corruption and the kind of political failures of Brazil, unfortunately, are letting down a process that could improve the quality of life of millions of people.
Great. Okay. Who's a question there? Change your mind? Yeah. Can you pass the microphone?
It's about football more generally rather than specific to Brazil. I hope that's okay. I was wondering whether you felt that the perception of football fans has changed massively, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. So the fact that people like Joe Barton can appear on Question Time, and that we're now having dialogues about Anelka using the quenelle, and whether Spurs can call themselves the Yadami, whether we've gone away from the perception being that football fans are all hooligans, and actually is that a positive? I mean, obviously it's a positive change to not be considered hooligans, but what you thought about that?
I'll respond to that in a moment, but David, I mean, you're the social historian of football. Let's say next year will be the 25th anniversary of Italia 90. Has the perception changed in that time frame?
So, without wishing to be pernickety, this is a question about English football fans in general, or British. It's not, I mean, we would be telling a different story if we were thinking about football fans in China or the United States. So actually this is a very specifically English question. Has the perception changed? Well, it all depends who's doing the perceiving, I would say. I don't think that there's a fixed opinion. I mean, if you read Peter Hitchens, then football is a kind of, neo-pagan religion, and unspeakably faux working class behaviour by the middle classes who can't cope, etc. So you'll hear that reading of it. You'll hear much more kind of leftist sort of readings about the kind of possibility and behaviour of crowds. I mean, I think what we can, rather than thinking about perception, I think we should probably, let's think about, the demographics have clearly changed of who actually is in football stadiums. It's compared to, the early 1990s, it's more feminised around the edges, but it depends where you go. The kind of class balance is actually not as hugely great as the transformations are often made out to be, because actually the middle class component of the crowd was pretty big in the 60s and 70s. And today it merely reflects the kind of changed class structure of the country as a whole. The very poor, the unemployed, the marginal have been excluded from the most expensive stadiums, that you can say. But otherwise, and in terms of how people behave and the perception, yeah, I think it has changed. I think, when you look at a football crowd, you see something about the changes of Britain in the last 25 years. The one thing that's really different is that it's much older. The audience is now, the average age of the audience in the top division has increased from sort of the mid-20s to nearly 40. And that's a really significant, I think is a really significant change. So yeah, I think the perception has changed. I mean, when you compare to where we were in the 70s, just the amount of disorder, the amount of violence, attitudes to racism, attitudes to homophobia amongst crowds are clearly different. Some people don't want to kind of recognise it. Other people want to say it's a disaster and a betrayal of the past. Others think, oh, here's an interesting political opportunity. I fall into that category.
Next year will be the 25th anniversary of Italia 90. I think some of you are probably old enough to have been to political festivals in 1990, 1991. Maybe think back to then. Was there a single session where you discussed sport? Was there a single session where you discussed football? And yet in 1990, a man went onto a football field and cried. It was a fundamental challenge to English masculinity, probably one of the most important challenges to English masculinity post-war, was when Gazza cried in that semi-final. He cried, for those of you who don't know, because he received a second yellow card, it meant he wouldn't play in the final. So the perception has changed, but to me, the forces which frame that perception haven't changed enough. David referred to the average age of a season ticket holder in England is 44. The average age of a fan in the Bundesliga is 21. Every club in the Bundesliga is owned by its fans. Germany is a fundamentally social democratic society. England isn't. So we have to engage and frame that. We have a rising phenomenon of community ownership of fan clubs. We should be part of that conversation. And we should have conversations like this about, I know there's going to be, I'm glad to see there's going to be a session on fashion, but also diet, film, photography, whatever. Anything that forms popular culture should be a space for us to contest and challenge and change ideas. And if we ignore sport, then we're ignoring something very important. To me, the most important sporting event this summer, and I say this as a heretic, is going to be the Tour de France. This is a world sporting event taking place in Yorkshire. I don't know how many of you are from Yorkshire, but I wonder how many global sporting events have ever taken place in Yorkshire. It will be free to watch. Oh, it takes over, I don't know how many 100 kilometres it's cycled over. It's thousands of kilometres cycled over. It's impossible to corporatise. Clara was on a plane from Brazil. The rest of us went to the England game last night. Wembley was like a Vauxhall dealers convention. You thought you were at Vauxhall versus Peru. Now that doesn't mean the fans don't want to be there. Of course they do. But there's a latent dissatisfaction, the way that, I worked on the FA Cup final. It was like a Budweiser's convention. What's Budweiser got to do with English football? Nothing whatsoever, apart from the fact they invest millions and millions of pounds in order to brand it. And it's sort of subliminal, it's very low in the consciousness, it needs to be challenged. And there's a common sense argument. Do we want big money to control our sports? And if this was a group of really hardcore football fans, the answer would be no. And we should be part of that conversation. The same is true across almost all aspects of popular culture. Okay, quick fire questions now to the panel. Sue, your greatest hope for 2014, World Cup 2014? Quick fire, one word. 1, 2, 3 words at most.
Well, I won't Brazil to win, and I want this, and I
Want Brazil to win?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I want this to form part of a kind of a positive mobilisation to get the country to face up to some of its really serious problems of
That's
social
England, I
inequality.
presume. So Brazil to win, England to
No,
face
no.
up to its problems. I like that. Justin?
I want the protest to remain centre stage. I don't want the football to be ruined. I want the spectacle to succeed, but I want the protest to be equal part of that, so it doesn't die down and be kind of overtaken by the money and the sport and everything. And I want Bosnia in the final.
His partner's Bosnian.
I just really hope nobody dies. Is my bottom line, is that nobody gets killed along the way. And in footballing terms, I've got a tenner on Suarez to score a hat-trick against England. So, I don't know quite, either way I'll be pleased.
He's injured at the moment.
Well, Brazil's victory, of course.
Okay. I'm going to answer my question by asking you a question, and the panel as well. Can any of you, you don't need to shout out the name, you just got to be honest, put your hand in the air if you can name the current president of Brazil. Okay, so that's not bad. This is a highly well-informed political audience. I assure you, counterpart members John Rees did not put his hand in the air. Okay, put your hand in the air if you can name a single current or past Brazilian international footballer. Okay, so that's unanimous. What my hope for this Brazil is this World Cup is it will transform our understanding of Brazil, so we know a little bit more about Brazil than just the football. Okay, I'm going to finish with, I think it was Jack who made a point, and he was fairly fiercely responded to by David. I'm sure you have a friendly conversation in the cafe afterwards about England and Englishness. This is a double-page spread ad in The Guardian today. I think it's all that's wrong with the moral superiority of the section of the left. It reads, a pull-out St George's flag not available in tomorrow's paper. To me, that is absolutely giving up on Englishness. We don't claim that Philosophy Football are the most important T-shirt company in the world. We don't claim to be the most imaginative T-shirt company in the world. But it's not the most difficult thing to do, to put an England flag on the Brazil shirt and spell it in Portuguese. That is the challenge that a paper like The Guardian should be engaging with, instead of saying they're not going to include a pull-out St George's cross in their paper. And it's also, hope nobody here is covering the event for The Guardian, back in 2004 and 2006, when England were doing well, this is the height of hypocrisy of its moral superiority, a pull-out St George's cross was precisely available in The Guardian. So England not doing well, we're going to give it up. In the week that UKIP are probably set to win the by-election in Europe, I think we need to get real. I'll finish with a commercial plug. We've got Clara, David and Sue's book, all half price today. You can buy them for £5. They'll be signed. Justin's isn't available. I think Houseman's have got them downstairs on the stall. If you haven't got the money with you today, you can get them as a set, plus Alex Bellos' excellent book on Brazilian football for £25 from Philosophy Football. So I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope you enjoy the World Cup, and I hope we can still have a better world with or without the football. Thank you very much.